All right. We are going to continue our discussion about elections with our second panel on elections. One of the biggest threats that partisan polarization plays is how it's now seeping into election administration, threatening free and fair elections and undermining public trust. I'm going to be headed over to Kirby for a breakout discussion with Rachel, who you met earlier, to have some Q&A. And then on the main stage here, we're going to have an extraordinary panel. Truly, I think some of the best national experts, a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, all coming together to talk to us about how we not only protect our right to vote, but to protect our right for our vote to be counted. And that conversation is going to be moderated by a colleague who I've grown fond in collaborating with over the past year. That's Matthew Weil. He's the executive director of BPC's Democracy program. So welcome, Matthew, and our next panel.
All right, ready? Well, thank you for coming back after that break for the third panel on elections today. My name is Matthew Weil, and I am the executive director of BPC's Democracy program. The Democracy program at BPC exists because we believe a healthy democracy requires three things: transparent and fair processes, trustworthy and accountable institutions, and civic-minded bipartisan leaders. And yet today, our country is adrift. Our electoral processes are under attack and must evolve. To strengthen the foundations that sustain representative democracy in our diverse nation, we need open discourse around real solutions to the problems that are so evident today. And I know that this panel is going to be great and open and effective discourse. It's a real honor for me to be up here with these panelists, and I'm going to introduce them from my left to right. Ben Ginsberg is a nationally known political law advocate. He's a distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, and he is the co-chair of the Election Official Legal Defense Network. He has represented 4 of the past 6 Republican candidates for president, but maybe most importantly, Ben, you were the co-chair with Bob Bauer of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which in 2013 and 2014 did really important work that moved the election administration in this country forward. So that is when I met Ben, and I was very privileged to work with Ben on that commission. Next to Ben is Secretary Chapman of Pennsylvania. She was appointed in January of 2022, and in that role, she leads the Department of State. That makes her the chief election official for all of our Pennsylvania voters in the crowd today. Previously, she was the executive director of Deliver My Vote, and she has held senior leadership positions at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and other nonprofits focused on election reform and advocacy. And one final panelist today is Amber McReynolds. Amber is one of the country's leading experts on election administration, policy, and innovation. She has served as the election official for the city of Denver, and she is the founder of the National Vote at Home Institute. In 2021, President Biden nominated and the Senate confirmed her to be a governor on the U.S. Postal Service Board of Governors. Amber is focused on strengthening democracy and improving the civic health of our nation. Thank you all for joining me today. So today's panel is focused on some of the threats to democracy, and that can be a difficult subject, but I hope that our panelists can focus on what those real threats are and some of the solutions that they are all working on. So I'm going to start with you, Secretary Chapman. Ultimately, our system of elections relies on individuals. There are poll workers, there are election officials at the local level and at the state level. And these people hold legitimate power in those positions, and yet they can sometimes use legitimate power to illegitimate ends. And so we're certainly seeing this cycle many people running for office who do not believe in the election results from the previous election. What is the risk there, in your view, of those people gaining office? And are we getting closer to an election that may not be certified when the results are fairly legitimate and clear?
Well, thanks for that question, and thank you for having me here today. As Pennsylvania's acting Secretary of State, my role is really to ensure that every eligible voter in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has the ability to register to vote, cast their ballot, and have it counted. So that's my first priority. And I took an office when I was sworn into this role. I took an oath of office. And I upheld the US Constitution, the state constitution, and every single election worker and election official upholds that oath of office as well. So that's something important to note. So I think one thing with threats, in Pennsylvania, we've seen some threats since 2020 to election workers, and it's concerning, right? It's un-American. There should be no place where we have threats to election workers. And in Pennsylvania, we've seen over 50 election directors in counties leave their jobs because of threats. Also, there were some other reasons, planned retirements or what have you, but we've had a huge turnover. So this election will be the first time a lot of county election directors are actually overseeing an election for the first time. So at the Department of State, my goal is to make sure that we are speaking with those election directors. We're providing support. We have county election office hours every 2 weeks, so we can answer questions they have. We can make sure that we're issuing guidance on litigation, legislation, and any questions that they have. But one thing that we're really doing is a lot of trainings. And since election infrastructure was designated as critical infrastructure in 2017 by the Department of Homeland Security, we've had extensive partnerships with the Department of Homeland Security, with the FBI. So we've had insider threat trainings just recently, a few weeks ago, that we hosted with Department of Homeland Security and the county, so they can identify anything that happens and address it right away.
Amber, I want to turn to you because you've been a local election official. You've seen the process that happens after Election Day. Why should voters have confidence in their election results?
Well, first, and it's great to be here with everyone, and thank you to the sponsors of this amazing event to talk about these really important issues. First and foremost, elections and election administration is highly regulated at the federal, but then the state and the local level. And there are a number of rules and procedures in place throughout the process, before the election, during the election, and post-election, to ensure that the results are accurate. And the one thing, and as serving as an election official, the way that I approached the work that we were responsible for doing is that we had to balance a certain set of values throughout the process, which I think are very important in making sure that the security of our elections and the sanctity of our elections are intact. And those values are that all election officials need to make sure that the election is fair, that it's accessible, secure, transparent, equitable, and reliable. And that acronym I use for that is FASTER. But all those values matter equally in the process. And that's really the role of election officials, to ensure that happens. Any policies or processes that don't achieve all of those values are not going to work effectively to put voters first and center the process around voters. So a couple of examples. Before the election even occurs, when election officials are programming and setting up the election process, they're doing a number of tests. They're running test ballots, so they're running the paper ballot test stacks through the equipment to make sure that the equipment, the scanners, which are usually off-the-shelf scanners, by the way, they don't have any secret algorithms or things behind them. They're literally just capturing the image of the scanned piece of paper. Many of you have scanners at home. They're capturing that image, and what we're doing is making sure that the scanner is, and then the software is able to read the precinct, that it's capturing all the data on there. All those tests happen before ballots are even out or finalized to voters. Then there's a number of public tests that happen, and some states call this public logic and accuracy test. And that is where the public literally can come in and see the test happening. And there's a test board, normally chosen in a bipartisan way by at least two major parties, and they actually mark ballots, and those get scanned again through the equipment. There's a hand tally to validate that the equipment sees the ballot in the same way that the hand talliers do. And in my experience, often the mistake we find is with the hand talliers because they're humans and they make mistakes. And these are complicated ballots, and humans are not necessarily good at repetitive tasks where you're looking at these sorts of things. So a lot of people will say, why can't we hand tally like France did? France counted one race. One race. Our ballots in this country have federal, state, local, all the way down to coroner or district attorney or sheriff, along with a number of ballot issues. So those are just a couple of examples. And then, of course, post-election, there's an audit process. In every state in the country, public is involved, people outside the process are involved. So all of this essentially means that you can absolutely trust the results. Are humans going to make mistakes? Yes, humans are going to make mistakes, but the good thing is we have a number of processes and procedures and steps to catch those mistakes when they happen, correct them, and make sure that the certified result is correct and accurate and a reflection of the will of the people.
So Ben, if we accept that the election officials, for the most part, are going to do their job, they have good processes, what is the likelihood that we're going to see certification boards, which are a little more partisan, not certifying legitimate results? I mean, this happened a little bit in the primary. How does that process play out?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here to my old hometown of Philadelphia. And let me put on my campaign hat to answer that question, actually. I think the way it plays out is sort of the same way it plays out whenever you have a little bit of disconnect. It is individuals who kind of go off the reservation. So what you've heard from Secretary Chapman and from Amber are the very sound practices in the election system, all the safeguards, all the ways that you can make sure that the results are accurate. But the bigger problem that we've got today is that roughly 30% of the population doesn't believe that the elections are accurate. In other words, they doubt what you've heard about all the checks. And so where the problem will come with poll watchers or elections officials is taking the doubts of the 30% and running them sort of in opposition to the really sound election system that we have. So the answer to the question of how to stop that is really to be sure that elections officials do a tremendous amount of outreach, are really, really transparent in the way they run elections, which you do here in Pennsylvania and largely around the country. But the outreach to the doubting 30% is really what's important to stop the poll watcher and county officials sort of going off the rails in the process. And by the way, if they do, there is a court system that's a check and balance, because we have checks and balances everywhere.
So Amber, you told us the process, which is strong. It's stronger than it's ever been. And with your many hats, you certainly know maybe all of the election officials in this country, and the vast majority of them are certainly upstanding. They want to be unbiased arbiters of what they are seeing in their jurisdiction. However, there have been several high-profile breaches of voting systems, of counters, of other election systems, not from foreign actors, but from duly elected and authorized election officials, including in your state of Colorado. And so what does that risk, what risk does that add to the process, and how do we mitigate that process? Because at the end of the day, certainly, we do need someone, a human, to actually operate the process.
Yeah, and to speak directly to the, we had an insider incident in Colorado, a county clerk that was elected in a fairly small, medium-sized county in Colorado, who, by the way, had served for 2 years, never raised any questions about any of the elections that she ran. But after 2020, she had, and sort of was contacted by a number of conspiracy theorists asking for access to the voting system. And she obliged, and she actually violated the law and the rules that exist in the state around security and let people in to do that. And the good thing that happened was the district attorney of her own party took swift action. The law enforcement locally of her same party took swift action. The FBI, the Secretary of State, all levels of government swiftly addressed and took action to replace equipment, to address the fact that she violated not only her oath, but also the law. And she's now under indictment. And that happened very quickly. It happened all across different party affiliations. It wasn't one party or the other holding her accountable. It happened across the spectrum. And so I think it was actually an example of what happens when you do breach your oath and breach the law. You are going to be held accountable by those different checks and balances that we have in place. And I think just on the merits of her actions, she never raised any issues about any of the systems or the processes or the election results themselves for more than 2 years while she served as county clerk, and only did it when she got a profile or could show up at events or receive extra money from people trying to push these conspiracies. So I think we just have to look at this and be honest about why it's happening. There's a lot of money going into this. A lot of people are making a lot of money off of filing lots of lawsuits and speaking at events and charging a lot of money for them to come hear about conspiracies that don't reflect what actually happens on the ground. And so I think we have to make sure that our systems can swiftly take care of people that try to do something they shouldn't be doing, that breaches the law or breaches their oath, and be transparent about the process around that.
I can promise the audience that none of these panelists were paid for their appearance today. So they're here because they want to be here for democracy, I promise you.
That's right.
So Secretary Chapman, how does the process work in Pennsylvania? How do you monitor what's happening among your locals? But also a broader question, do you think that these breaches that have happened now in Colorado, in Michigan, in Georgia, impact voters' confidence in the Pennsylvania voting process?
So as I mentioned, we have 67 counties here in Pennsylvania, and I oversee elections in the Commonwealth as the chief election official. And one thing to note that's unique about Pennsylvania is I'm appointed by the governor, and there's actually only 4 other states that have secretaries of state that are also chief election officials that are appointed by the governor. So I'm not elected like many other states. So it's really important that in my role, I'm nonpartisan. My goal is to make sure that every eligible Pennsylvanian can vote and ensure that counties are following the law, which is critical. And so that's why, as Secretary of State, I issue guidance and directives to really just create rules for counties to follow the law. So, for example, we had a lawsuit after the primary around ballots without dates, right? So there was a lawsuit, and in the federal court, there was a holding that said that ballots without dates should be counted because the date's immaterial to the vote, right? A lot of times people might put their birthday when they're signing their ballot. They might get confused and put another date. But the thing is, the county, when those ballots come in, they stamp them, they record them, they make sure that they're timely counted. So we issued guidance telling counties to count all of those ballots without dates because that's following the law. So if counties have questions around that, as I mentioned, we have our office hours, we support them. I also certify voting equipment and machines as Secretary of State. But I think it's just important that counties have clear guidance. And with the law in Pennsylvania, with Act 77, which brought mail-in voting to Pennsylvania in 2019, we've had a lot of change recently. That reform was the most change we've seen in over 80 years, and there's been a lot of litigation as a result of that. So there's confusion. So we're making sure that there's clarity as these court decisions come down. We've had more litigation than we've ever had. And it's also really important that we are pre-bunking and debunking mis and disinformation that's been prevalent since 2020. We've seen more mis and disinformation around mail-in voting, for example. So my office has a comprehensive voter education campaign called Ready to Vote, where we are really aimed at meeting voters where they are. And we're sending emails and text messages to voters on a regular basis. We have ads on social media, on the PA Turnpike, in cabs. So it's really about educating voters so they understand the process and they understand the rules about how to vote here in Pennsylvania.
we can't have a panel about threats against democracy without also talking about threats against those individuals who deliver the democracy. And so, Ben, you are the co-chair of the Election Official Legal Defense Network. So what does that group do, and why is that work important?
Well, we formed the EOLDN with Bob Bauer, who was a Democratic lawyer who I was co-chair with on the Presidential Commission. We run it out of a group called the Center for Election Innovation and Research, run by David Becker. When Bob and I did the Presidential Commission, we spent a lot of time talking to state and local election officials and really came to respect the job that they do and the dedication that they show and really the amount of hours that goes into the job. So when the threats in this past cycle to election workers came up, we formed EOLDN, and we have three main components of that. One is we provide pro bono legal services to elections officials who are under threat. We pair them up with volunteer lawyers. Any lawyers who want to volunteer, we welcome your engagement on that. We're far busier than we should be on this. These threats should not be happening, but they are. We also have a pro bono communications service available to elections officials because we found that often when the crisis hits and they're under threat and they're charged, there's a lot of press interest in it, and we thought we could be helpful in providing some really professional campaign-hardened communications specialists to help. And then the other part that we want to do is what we call the Pillars of the Community program. And we realized in helping elections officials, we were sort of treating the symptom but not the disease. And the real disease is really what you talked about on the first panel today, which is the huge polarization in the country and that people can't talk to each other. So the concept is we will get leaders of the community, from the business community, the faith community, civic organizations, educational associations, across the political spectrum to come and meet with the elections officials. And we want the elections officials to describe exactly the checks and balances and safeguards in the system to the leaders of the community. We hope that the leaders of the community will buy in to the strength of our election system. And so if there is a tight election and the results are threatened and election officials are threatened, these leaders of the community will be able to stand up and say, we know this system, the system works, we have faith in our elections officials, and we hope that'll help to diffuse some of the really poisonous problems that the system faces and poll workers in particular face.
So Amber, you and I travel the country. We know a lot of these election officials. I hope I can ask you to speak to this audience on behalf of all election officials, which I know is difficult, to try to provide context for what these threats against them, but even worse, their families, and sometimes children, means to them, and how that's really impacting just the field of election administrators and what it's really done to election administrators.
Yeah, well, first, I mean, as an election official myself, my first threat occurred before 2016. And it was a death threat. It came into the office because I simply tried to correct a candidate who was lying and just being dishonest about our Colorado voting model. And so I corrected him and then also re-invited him and his campaign to come through our office. One of the things I had set up in Denver years ago, back going to 2010, was tours. So we'd always invite all the candidates that were on the ballot, their campaign staffs. We'd educate them on how the process is going to work. And then we would tour them through every step in the process. They were invited to go to the poll worker trainings. We had this huge transparent process. So when the candidate in question was being dishonest about the model at the time, and this is again, long time ago, before 2016, I simply corrected them, and then the next day I got in the office and there was an email with a picture of a gun range saying that they were going to, take me out on the gun range. And the police did their thing and responded to it, but honestly, I kind of looked at it and thought, well, how silly and ridiculous that would occur. 2020 comes and goes, and this got far worse for election officials around the country, their families, their children, the nature of some of the threats against various secretaries, they're not normal things that you would see, and most of the country's poll workers are women, by the way, and so the highly sexualized nature of some of the threats, the racist threats that came in, and just the targeting. And often a lot of the men election officials would get threats about their wives or their children, including their daughters. And this continued to happen. And this is not isolated to one part of the country. This is continuing to happen. And I was not an election official in 2020. I was working for a nonprofit. But I got all those same death threats. Pictures of my children sent to me, threats like you're going to be hung outside your house in front of your children. And this was in November 2020. This was far before January 6th that these things were materializing across the country. And it's continuing. And there's finally starting to be some accountability. And there's been a number of cases that have been prosecuted. But there are thousands of these sorts of threats that are out there and active and have not been acted upon by law enforcement. And that's one of the things I would encourage this audience is, check in with your election officials and see how you can help them, but also make sure that you're holding the mechanisms of government that should be holding these people accountable for making these threats, because that needs to happen. And if it's not happening and there's not accountability for this, it's never going to stop. And so election officials are reporting things and they're doing their best to stay in front of it. They're doing their best to be transparent and educate the public, but there's also another layer of government with the accountability piece that needs to happen. And we need to push for that collectively as a community.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to put a finer point on it too. The number of state election officials and local officials, we heard 50 out of 67 in Pennsylvania that have retired since 2020, and the loss of that institutional knowledge is huge. And how it will impact 22 and 24, I think, is yet to be seen, but it will have an impact. These election officials will be running their first election in a federal election. That's difficult to do. Secretary Chapman, I want to turn to you about poll workers. Poll workers are obviously the backbone of the process, and yet again, it's a human component to elections. So one, are you concerned about getting enough poll workers for the state of Pennsylvania? But a second, kind of more sinister question, is we've heard reports that partisans are moving maybe away from poll observation to more trying to infiltrate the poll worker process, to get their people in because they know there's fraud and they have to be there to see it. Are you concerned about that? And if so, how do you mitigate that?
Sure. So there's always a poll worker shortage in Pennsylvania. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, everybody was doing a lot of recruitment around poll workers in 2020 because typically, the population is older that serves as poll workers. So, but there's always been an issue with filling positions. So just to put some data on it, in Pennsylvania, we have over 9,100 polling places throughout the 67 counties. So to have a fully staffed polling place, you need around 5 poll workers. So we're looking at over 45,000 poll workers that we need to have a fully staffed force on election day. So we've done a lot of recruitment efforts. We participated in Help America Vote Day in August. And on that one day, I believe we recruited over 1,000. We're continually recruiting them. The last time I checked, I think it was around 5,000 that we've recruited through our website, which is vote.pa.gov/getinvolved. So we're hoping that more people will sign up over the coming days as we get closer to the election. But there's always been that concern around insider threat. And we are hearing about efforts to recruit individuals to become poll workers, poll watchers, that could potentially interfere with the process. So, we're monitoring those efforts. We're monitoring social media posts around that recruitment. We're partnering again with federal and state law enforcement. And that training that we had was essential around insider threat. We're having a training in the next few weeks around de-escalation training for counties so they know what to do in the event that there could be some type of confrontation. So, we're in the point now, it's a little unfortunate, but we're planning for every possible scenario. And we just want to be as prepared as possible. But there are also a lot of checks and balances as we talk about, right? So as people sign up to be poll workers through our website, it goes to the county. The county follows up with that individual, but those poll workers have to go to training. So there are some checks and balances, and once again, as I mentioned, the oath of office, which I think is so important. Poll workers also take that very important oath of office to ensure that they're upholding the Constitution. And we're confident that if anything happens, then people who are looking to interfere with that election process will be referred to law enforcement and will be prosecuted.
Well, we're going to have two lines at the end of this panel. One for Ben, for all the pro bono attorneys who want to work with Ben, and one over here for Secretary Chapman who want to be poll workers. And if you want to do both, I can do an extra star.
Hers should be longer.
We have not covered nearly half of the topics I wanted to cover in the beginning part of this panel. I only have 15 minutes left. So I want to move on to casting doubt on results. And I'm going to turn to Ben for that first. There seems to be a rise or an increase in the number of candidates that reflexively dispute the election results, even when they're pretty clear. So what's incentivizing that, and how can we maybe find a way to turn down that attention they get for doing so?
They're incentivized in part because you had a presidential candidate using it with some success in the Republican process. I mean, the incentive is electoral success more than anything else. And so that's why the 2022 election becomes so important, because that is really the first test of whether that works with the general election audience, whether denying elections, the whole panoply of charges that come out are tested on the ballot in 2020. The Washington Post did a really comprehensive look at all the election denier candidates that are on the ballot. Story ran, I think, in today's paper. It is worth looking at for all of that. So the single best way to deal with it is at the ballot box. Having said that, it is important to look really for sort of truth squatting by election officials. And so if there are close races this time, and there are always close races, the way the recounts and the contests and the court cases in the different states are carried out becomes really important. Because as someone who's done a lot of recounts, that is the time when you kick open the hood on our elections. And so the aftermath of the 2022 election will become a testing ground, as it never has before, in how well and how accurate our elections are.
And certainly, we at the Bipartisan Policy Center believe that candidates should use all of their full legal recourse if they want to challenge. But Amber, I'm hoping you can explain for the audience a little bit about what these never-ending recounts or this new bug of our system, which is these choose-your-own-adventure audits, really do for local election officials.
Sorry. The partisan review of the election is what I would call the Arizona thing. Well, first, I mean, like Ben said and like Matt just said, I mean, candidates have recourse under the law. If something didn't go right, whether that was a technology failure like what happened in New York City in 2018 and there were 7-hour lines at polling places, can you imagine that, 7-hour lines? That doesn't get covered because New York's not a swing state. But that happened, right? And so there's recourse for anyone on the ballot to go in and ask for hours to be extended, or for the voting process. Like, there are processes for this. Same as there's a process for a candidate, sometimes it's an automatic recount, or sometimes it's a recount that you can request and you can pay for. But this sort of endless request process that keeps happening is simply designed to cast doubt on democracy, on the process, on everything going forward. It's not designed to be part of the recourse process that normally would occur under the law. So I think it's really important that election officials continue to defend the process that exists in the law, that is there for a purpose to ensure fair elections. This is part of the process. And then I think the other big piece is transparency. And I did a number of things when I was an election official. A number of election officials have implemented these very things over the last few years, including elections advisory groups in the communities that includes community leaders that you can educate about the process, including public tours, including media tours. A number of jurisdictions now stream the entire ballot counting process online. So if you have your doubts, you can go and watch. You can go in person to watch, or you can watch online, and that's available in a number of jurisdictions, including Philadelphia does that in Pennsylvania. So there are just a number of processes. And so we don't, this sort of, once you've exhausted all of those and you're still not happy, you don't just get to kind of create your own, choose your own audit process and make stuff up. In fact, the Arizona Partisan Review didn't find anything should be different. The 3 different hand counts in Georgia confirmed the results, confirmed that the scanners were accurate. The Dominion system has been audited more than any other voting system in the entire country and gone through risk-limiting audits, which are the highest form of audit, of any other system, thousands and thousands over the last 5 to 7 years. And that doesn't get talked about. But there are recourses that exist. Follow that process, follow the law. And then once you start going beyond that, it is out of scope. And there's a reason that there's not wins happening in court systems, because the evidence just doesn't exist to align with the claims that are being made.
So Secretary Chapman, Pennsylvania has had a close election or two. It also tends to take a long time to get results in Pennsylvania. So are there ways to decrease that amount of time between the close of polls and when there's somewhat clear election results are available, even though we can concede right here, nothing is final on election day?
Right, thank you for that question. So just so everyone knows, it's going to take time for us to count results this November. We're not going to have unofficial returns on election night in Pennsylvania. And that's really due to the limits in the law. So in Pennsylvania, counties aren't able to start processing, or what we call pre-canvassing, mail-in ballots until 7 a.m. on election day. Many other states can do this weeks or even days before the election. Like, that's why Florida, for instance, in 2020 was able to have their unofficial returns on election night because they have pre-canvassing. So the 67 counties can't start even opening the outer envelope, opening the inner envelope, flattening those ballots until 7 a.m. on election day.
And you're not busy on election day at all,
right? This is the same time when counties are running polling places. Remember I said 9,100 polling places. So there's a lot happening, so it's going to take days. But it's important for us to just educate our friends, our family, the public about that. That doesn't mean that there's anything nefarious happening with our elections. It doesn't mean that ballots are showing up after the election. It's just taking time for election officials to do their job and ensure that every single eligible vote is counted. So the one thing that would fix this, and this is a bipartisan proposal that Republicans and Democrats in all 67 counties support, is for Pennsylvania to have that ability to pre-canvass, and the recommendation is at least 2 weeks. So if there were 2 weeks for election officials to be able to process those ballots, we would all have election results much sooner, which is what everybody wants. But until then, it's going to take a few days.
Well, you heard it here first, so don't expect it on election night.
Yes, no.
It's important. I have been horrible at managing our time, but I do want to ask you, Ben, to talk about the judicial system and how it impacts voter confidence. I think before this panel we were discussing a little bit about judges that are effectively legislating from the bench. What is that doing to our process, and how can we stop that?
Well, if you're going to look at the judiciary in general, let's remember that in 2020, when there were so many cases brought post-election, that the judiciary, judges nominated by presidents of both parties, did really an impeccable job of interpreting the law. So that when the system was under its greatest stress, you have to give the judiciary a lot of credit for following the law as it existed. There are times, however, where judges in fashioning remedies sometimes take on the roles of legislatures. So the U.S. Supreme Court is hearing a very important case out of North Carolina on the independent state legislature doctrine, which the court has a whole range of things it can talk about. One of the things that they are likely to do is to cut back on the ability of judges to assume a legislative function as they do remedies, so that the cases in the redistricting context, so a court absolutely has the authority to declare a map unconstitutional or contrary to law, but in fashioning the remedy, it can't step into the role that's been delegated to a legislature. So there again, the checks and balances in the system when courts step too far out of line in terms of interpreting legislatures. There are checks, and in this case, the U.S. Supreme Court to bring that back into line.
Secretary Chapman, how do you think that court ruling might impact Pennsylvania?
Oh, it definitely will impact Pennsylvania. So, as I mentioned, we've had more litigation than we've ever had since 2020. In 2020 alone, there were 30 court cases. In 2022, right now, we have over a dozen court cases. And those cases have been really helpful with clarifying what the law is, because as I mentioned, we had a huge election reform in Act 77 in 2019. So that was the biggest reform in over 80 years. So those court cases and court decisions have helped clarity for counties on what ballots to count. So it would definitely have an impact in Pennsylvania. And in 2018 with redistricting, the court actually redrew a map. So yes, we're definitely watching that case in the Supreme Court.
Well, we've spent about 40 minutes now, I think, scaring everybody in the room. And I'll know this is why I'm not allowed to speak at my Thanksgiving table anymore. However, I do want to use the last 2 minutes to go down the line and have each of you share why you have confidence that even though there are threats to democracy, we're going to be okay in 22 and we're going to be okay in 24. Ben, you're the most optimistic one on this panel, so I'm going to go with you first.
It's a scary concept. Our system has worked because the people involved in it rise to the occasion and have that sort of inbred faith and confidence in the country and in the system. And so I do take a great deal of solace from the people who are in the system and knowing right from wrong. And then in the sort of laws category, the checks and balances that we do have that came from the Constitution have given those good people the tools to be able to sort of right the ship when it needs righting.
Secretary Chapman?
Sure. Voters in Pennsylvania can have confidence in the security of our election system. Over the last 8 years in this administration, we have implemented online voter registration. We've spent over $100 million to replace voting systems that are secure, that have been certified by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission and the state. We've implemented mail-in voting for all eligible voters. We've made strides when it comes to streamlining the process for just election administration in general. So voters can feel confident that every eligible vote in Pennsylvania that's cast will be counted, and I'm definitely going to make sure that that happens this election. I think it's important that you're educating your friends and family just about the process, how it works, have these conversations about the fact that we're not going to have unofficial returns on election night and explain why and explain that it just takes a few days. So we all have a part in this.
Amber?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, so I didn't get to answer a lot of optimistic questions until now.
Sorry.
So I think for sure the people, and Ben and Secretary Chapman just mentioned this, the people that run our elections are true public servants. They want to serve. They want to do good for all voters. They don't care who you vote for. They want to make sure the process is good for you. And that's generally the scope of election administrators across the country. They don't get paid a lot of money. Like, this is truly a public service job, and they want to do good. And then I think the other piece that I'm optimistic about is voters. I don't think voters in this country are going to vote for, or should not vote for, someone who doesn't think your vote should count. And that's kind of the difference between certain candidates and other candidates. Do you believe in democracy? Do you believe in election results and the process? Are you going to respect that? Are you going to protect that? And the fact is, there's candidates that don't think your vote should count. And so I think that voters are going to choose wisely. And my hope is that it's record turnout. The fact is, 2020, 80 million people did not vote in what was a record turnout year. 67% of the country voted, and that left about 80 million eligible voters that didn't vote. So I would encourage you all to do everything you can to encourage your communities to vote, and also serve as poll workers and come into the process and take your high school students to be poll workers. Do all of that, because that's how you can best support democracy and the people that are working to protect it.
So please stay in your seat. We're going to have our keynote address next. But before that, I hope you'll join me in thanking this panel: Ben Ginsberg, Secretary Chapman, and Andrew McReynolds. All right.